Hello, I'm going to do a quick tutorial here on how to fix invalid geometry in QGIS. And so for the example here, I've got a land use data set of southern New Hampshire, as well as a polygon for the boundaries of a town there. An example for when you might find that you have invalid geometry might be when doing a clip on something like a large data set, such as a land use. And so here I have land use as my input, and my boundary here is the overlay layer. And when I run it, I end up getting this error here that says a certain feature has invalid geometry. And as it turns out, there's multiple things that actually have invalid geometry in this. And so we're going to go and fix it. The first step to solving this problem is to go and find where it's actually invalid. So the first place we go is up to our vector tools into geometry, and we have to check the validity of the land use polygon data set here. The way that I do it is I keep it mostly on the defaults here, although you can change the method if you'd like. And two things that you will need for this are the valid output and the invalid output. And you don't necessarily need the error output, but you could keep it. Alright, once you run the check validity, you'll get a data set that looks like this, with three outputs here: the error, the invalid, and the valid. Error are just points within the invalid output, so we can choose to ignore those. An example of a place where the geometry is wrong is something like this, where you have an issue with the shape of the polygon. And if you go into the table for the invalid output, you can see that the table now has a new section called errors, and it defines what kind of error each of the polygons is facing. And in this case, all of the polygons have a self-intersection problem, where one of the lines is likely overlapping one another. The first step to fixing this, although it might sound unconventional, is for the invalid output to be buffered. But the difference is that we're actually going to be buffering it by nothing. Alright, first thing you're going to want to do is set the distance to 0 for the invalid output. All the other settings can be set to the defaults, and you should also make sure this is unchecked, the dissolve result, because you want all the polygons to still remain individuals for when you put it all back together. And you want to open the output file after running the buffer. Alright, after running the buffer, you should have a new data set here that is exactly the same, but it's now called buffered. It should have all the same information in the table, and if it doesn't, you should probably go back and see if you made a mistake somewhere in the settings for one of the tools. And after that, we just have to put both of these data sets back together, because although the buffer may not really be any different from the invalid, the program interprets it differently and now interprets these as just all normal polygons. And so go up to Vector into the geoprocessing tools and you do a union. For this, you do need a specific order. You have to input the buffered layer, and then you have to overlay the valid output on top of it. And the reason is that if you do it the other way around, you could get an error. This should be what your union tool should look like, and you should open the output file after running the algorithm. For this tool, it actually takes quite a bit of time, at least in my case, to run the tool. So just be patient with it. It should work in the end, but for me it took quite a while, especially with such a large data set here. Alright, so after running the union tool, you should have a new data set that looks like this. Should look like the original data set, except all symbolized in just a single color. But one thing you will notice is that the attribute table will actually be quite different. But the most important thing to note here is now you have two areas here. You have the original fields from the original data set all on one side, and you'll have an exact copy of those fields plus an additional errors field from the previous check validity. And additionally, in my case, I also have some additional records that have been added. Comparing this to my original land use data set, I actually have 9 additional records, and conveniently, this has put all of those 9 new records at the top here. These are actually all records that we will be getting rid of because they're copies of other records that are already in the table. And also they have conflicting data on both sides. For example, you have the acreage here as 606, whereas on the other side it says 0.197. These are all just copies, and I suspect there's some sort of error going on during the union that's making these new records appear. But we'll first get rid of all of them. One thing you could do is go into your select features using an expression tool and saying FID is more than 0 and FID2 is more than 0, and I'll select all of them for you. Or in my case, I can just select all of them individually in the table here and get rid of them. Other than that, you have now all of these records on this side, and down here you'll have more records on the other side. This is no issue, we can get rid of them pretty easily. Again, we're going to go into the select by expression tool, and what you're going to do is, in this case, we're going to select all of the records that are down here so we could move all this information into the correct fields. So what we're going to do is go into the fields and values. We're going to select where FID is null. And that should select all of the records that have null values down here. And next what you're going to want to do is open your editing tool for the fields here. And you're going to open the field calculator and select Update Existing Field. Then you're going to go update, for example, the FID, and go down here, and the FID number is going to be the same thing as FID2. We're just transferring the information from this field over to the original FID field. And you rinse and repeat that process for all these other fields. After all of that is done, you're going to go up here to this tool, the delete field tool, and you'll select all of the ones that you want to get rid of. In our case, we want to get rid of the errors and all of the copies of the original of the repeated fields here. And once that's all done, one thing you're going to probably want to do is save this data set and make sure you can share it with other people or export it somewhere outside the project. You should go over onto the union and go export and save the feature as whatever you want. In this case, I saved it as a shapefile. And then you have a new fixed land use dataset. You can go change the symbology to be like the original if you want, but one important thing to look at is just make sure that your table looks completely right. In my case, it looks all good. All the records are in the right place, there are no extra ones, and they're the same number of records up here as in my original land use dataset. And so that is how you fix invalid geometry in QGIS. Thank you.